flagging down Jesse, who is now in the building. So I knew that Chad could answer a few more questions anyways, but we will be scheduling a trip out to Rockdale to see this facility. But we talked to a lot of people earlier in the day that are building infrastructure, but then also when you see a structures like this and a business like this, whenever somebody says that Bitcoin isn't backed by anything, kind of falls by the wayside. So having facilities like this and the impact that it's having in towns like Rockdale, it's going to be happening all over the place, and it's not just going to have an economic impact in those towns, but what we're about to now talk about is grid stability, and that a lot of times people talk about how Bitcoin wastes energy, quote. One, they don't understand how much energy is actually wasted, but that Bitcoin actually serves a net benefit in the world of energy, and one of those being contributing to grid stability. And so, but as we were planning this talk, Nick Gates, who works at Priority Power and is a contributor at the Houston Bitcoin Meetup, Priority Power is a sponsor of the Bitcoin Commons. Thank you. He was like, it's not just grid stability; it's grid stability and advancement. And so this talk is not just on grid stability, but it is on grid stability and advancement. So Nick, why don't you come on up? Jesse should be right behind. Let's see, Jesse, are you in the room yet? Can someone can you pop your head in the hallway? Yeah, Jesse might be. And then where's Marty? You gonna lead this? All right. Okay. So hop on up here. So Nick Gates, here, Nick, why don't you sit here? Yeah. These three seats are have more coverage. So no, Marty, this way. That seat over there gets the least amount of eyesight from over here. So Nick Gates is the Senior Business Development Manager at Priority Power. Nick will talk about a lot of the things they do, but one of the things is I've just been kind of talking slowly until Jesse got here.
Yeah, that's all right. We need some more space between us and Chad.
Jesse,
that's a hard act to follow.
Looking yokes these days.
Yes, yeah, we needed it to kind of like take the energy down a little bit. But Nick is the Senior Business Development Manager at Priority Power. They help procure power in addition to developing solutions for a lot of large Bitcoin miners. I believe maybe some of the ones in this room. And then Jesse is the CTO and co-founder of Hodl Ranch. And they will talk about what Bitcoin is doing to not only stabilize the grid, but also help advance the grid. And Marty Bent here, who is one of the greatest champions against ESG, will help us understand this better, and then we will go take the message to the rest of the world.
We will end ESG. You need to leave that mic here, sir.
Sorry.
Gentlemen, it's a pleasure being up here with you. I think before we dive into the details of how Bitcoin mining can help grids and from a security and advancement perspective, let's jump into how grids currently work, where they may be inefficient, and where the biggest problems are specifically.
Okay, well, we're going with problems and not the good stuff that's happening on the grid. I guess we'll skip to the Q&A part. Someone's going to raise their hand and say, isn't Texas kind of a crappy grid? The winter storm proved that, and the answer is no. We are the freest market in America, and at the end of the day, that has driven businesses on the generation, on the load side, renewables, and on top of it, there's a lot of resources here. There's solar. We have a desert out in the west side of Texas. There's a lot of wind. There's a giant wind tunnel called the CREZ, Continental Renewable Energy Zone. So, there's this thing called oil and gas as well that's sitting there, and it's been there with a long-standing infrastructure in place to transport it around to the appropriate places. So in terms of problems, a lot of the problems come from different industries going away for a reason or another. Aluminum smelting went away. Well, now all of a sudden there's no reason to additionally add any lines coming into the Sandow switch until Chad gets in there. And as soon as Chad does, and he's trying to get to 700 megawatts, things have to happen to get there. lines have to be upgraded. It might not be directly in there, but upstream of it, for the reliability calculations that the grid does, a lot of stuff has to happen. So one of our biggest problems is a lot of areas have lost load for one reason or another. Oil and gas turned down for a little while. All of a sudden, load drops out there, and you don't have nearly as many new lines coming in. New lines are more efficient than old lines. Whenever both sides fight with each other, they say, electric cars aren't that efficient because of line loss. Well, they're using the old numbers. The newer the line, the bigger the line, the more efficient it is. So there's a lot of good stuff happening on the grid, and a lot of people have opposing views on ESG. ESG, I don't think should be killed. It should be redefined or just defined in general. Everyone has a different meaning for it, but
We're not getting into an ESG discussion.
I personally think it just means, hey, should we pollute a little less, be good people, and run good our company well? And I think that is a very good idea. It doesn't mean we should kill all fossil fuels. Should we maybe try to fix a few leaks? That's the way I look at it. Sorry, I just want to...
No, that's good. I think if you look at sort of in general the way that the grid works, it is a masterpiece of human engineering. You're basically trying to balance an elephant on a knife's edge. And it's this perfect balance of supply and demand. And historically, the way that happened was your demand is going to be variable. You don't know when people want to turn on their lights or charge whatever or run their toaster. But the supply could always ramp up and down to meet that demand. And then with the explosion in renewables, it's thrown a massive wrench into the grid. So the renewables have created a ton of value for the state. They're by far the biggest energy resource that our state has. But making use of those renewables without messing up our grid is difficult. They vary dramatically in production. Wind production can vary by 4 gigawatts per hour, and that's at current levels, and that's increasing. So you need something that can balance that supply and demand, and your traditional peaker plants just aren't fast enough to do that. So it's things like demand response at large scale with Bitcoin mining that is really changing the game for the grid. A lot of these historical demand response programs have been around for a long time. People have had very low participation because it was stuff like, they want you to give up air conditioning on the hottest day in the summer at the peak of the day. Nobody wants to do that. So you need something at industrial scale that can respond at low latency. And Bitcoin is by far the best thing to do that.
Why is it the best thing to do that?
So a lot of different types of industry can do demand response, but not everybody can respond at the same latency. So if you think like, a steel plant can turn offline, but you may need hours of notice. Samsung, for example, they had a fab that unexpectedly lost power during the winter storm. They had over $200 million of damage because of that, because they cannot just turn off on a dime. A Bitcoin miner is completely different. Those are computers that you can just stop a computer program and the power consumption cuts by 99%. So it's very easy to take those and modulate the demand on the grid and balance the grid, whereas your traditional types of industrial demand response were much higher latency. They're much more chunky. They can't respond nearly as finely to those changes. So they weren't appropriate for this new era of renewable energy in ERCOT.
And Texas is a free market, so at the end of the day, economics win. And if you can invest in a megawatt worth of Bitcoin mining that has the same effect as a megawatt worth of battery, how that works, as you were saying with the balancing, if you need another megawatt of load, you can either put more generation on, or you can take a megawatt of load off. So, if your two options are have a battery that's just sitting there doing nothing, or having a Bitcoin mine that's running, making money, economics are going to win. Bitcoin mine is going to be a better option from an economic standpoint, as well as all the reasons he mentioned.
Well, I would say that Bitcoin and batteries are complementary resources when it comes to the grid. They provide differentiated value. So your batteries are really good at providing like a 1 hour peak supply of energy. You have those peaks in the year where during the summer, there's just this high peak for just an hour or two, and you might have this for a couple of days out of the year. It doesn't make sense to build a natural gas peaker plant just to run those couple peaks. Batteries are really good at that. But what batteries are not good at is soaking up all of the negative pricing and very low pricing that these renewable projects get. So the thing about renewable energy is that when it's being produced, when it's all being produced at the same time, that's when the price goes negative or nearly to zero. So the vast majority of the megawatt hours that are produced by wind farms and solar farms, they get very little value for, because there's not an offtake for those. So that limits the development of additional resources, because they just financially aren't being compensated for the energy that's being produced. So having Bitcoin miners that are able to go out there right where that energy is being produced, they can soak up that off-peak demand, and that can enable additional capacity to be built And then when the grid is really stressed and it needs that capacity, Bitcoin miners can turn off and it's available.
So when we're building out this additional capacity, how a lot of the additional capacity that is being built out is wind and solar. Is this a good idea? Because you can build out gigawatts of capacity.
So
wait, I'm going to finish my question. You can build out gigawatts of capacity, but you can't make the wind blow and you can't make the sun shine.
Yeah, well, I would say that I think there's sort of like a disanalogy in terms, and that like wind and solar energy are the cheapest sources of energy. They are not a source of capacity. They, as you said, you cannot make the wind blow or the sunshine. So they are just not a one-for-one replacement for a natural gas plant. That doesn't mean that they're not valuable. It's just that the megawatt hours that a wind or a solar plant are going to generate are always going to be worth less than those dispatchable megawatt hours from a natural gas plant. And that's a pure economics question. If wind and solar are profitable to replace those off-peak hours, people will build those plants. If they're not, then they won't build them. And this is one of the reasons why, like for example, in Texas is now the #1 producer of wind power. It's the #1 installer of solar. It's going to be #1 producer of solar very soon. That's despite not having specific subsidies. Like California has way more subsidies, all these specific state subsidies for wind and solar, but they do not have the same level of market competition. It's our lack of red tape. It's the resources that are available here. That's the reason why Texas is the #1 place for renewable energy in the US. And it's the reason why that's going to continue to grow. Even if you took away the solar subsidies today, solar tax credit is 26%. 5 years ago, like just over the past 5 years, solar has dropped over 40% in price. So if you took away the tax credits, it sets back the industry like 2 years. It's not driven by tax credits the way that it was 15 years ago.
So solar also has a unique profile with it. When it's sun shining, solar's producing. And Texas still has a large amount of load that is driven by AC and cooling needs. So it is very complementary. There's a little gap at the end of that, but I think the best isn't necessarily going and building out an entire solar, entire wind. It's a mix, and ERCOT has one of the better mix profiles, which is what makes it so good. He's mentioning the tax credits, and it was already on path with where the investment tax credits were, and then new administration comes in and bumps it back up. Whenever they did that for an extended 2 years, the number of interconnect projects climbed up. So, ERCOT is looking at a solar problem. Everyone says renewable energy is great, and it is, don't get me wrong. But if you overbuild in a particular area that doesn't necessarily have the demand for it, everyone says, oh, it's great, you just need batteries for excess power. Well, once again, we're in a free market, and excess power just means negative pricing. So negative pricing does not, there's a reason not many wind projects have come online. And that's negative pricing. The ones that are up there that locked in their projects whenever the investment, that's production tax credit, they locked it in. Well, all these guys building now don't have that, so they have to compete with someone that has a government subsidy. So it creates a imbalance, but overall, that's driven down the price of the grid, which has brought more load to the state and will ultimately help the natural gas guys. But we don't want to be a strictly one commodity tied power producer, or else last year our power price would 2.5 times, which no one wants. It's climbing right now with natural gas going up, but that's mitigated by the solar and the wind and everything else that's on the grid.
Yeah, one thing that I think it's important to point out about Texas is that Texas is not like the rest of the US when it comes to renewables. It is the only place in the US where you see the wind corridor and the sun corridor intersect. So the best solar resources go from Southern California to West Texas, the best wind resources from West Texas north to Canada. It is the only place in the US where you have that high capacity factor wind and high capacity factor solar in the same geographic area. And that is massive when it comes to the actual cost of integrating that to the grid, because those are complementary production profiles. So wind is producing more at night, solar obviously is producing during the day. That allows you to get a lot more utility out of your infrastructure and requires a lot less in terms of energy storage or demand response versus like trying to integrate just solar into Southern California or just wind in Wyoming. It's a big differentiated value. The other thing that I think is important to mention around like the energy storage and stability is obviously we need a mix of different sources on the grid. Right now, it's basically just wind and solar that's being built out. We're probably going to have to build other resources as well, with the population of the state increasing, the load on the grid increasing. Whether that is natural gas or that's nuclear or what that's going to be, remains to be seen based on economics. It's likely going to be a significant amount of gas being built out due to the resources we have in the state. But all the economic incentives are there. So a lot of the problems that exist on the grid are really just market structure problems. So for example, you were mentioning the point on solar is complementary to the grid since a lot of our load on the grid is air conditioning based, and air conditioning based load correlates with the weather. So on a foggy day, you're not going to have as much air conditioning load. Now, you do have this duck curve problem that you get in California where towards the late hours of the afternoon and the evening, then your production drops off right when the demand is peaking. But that's actually just a pricing issue. If we priced power according to the actual cost in each one of those hours, people could shift their consumption. So you can just simply run your air conditioner harder earlier in the day rather than wait until you get home to turn on your air conditioner. There's part of the philosophy around energy conservation, I think, is fundamentally flawed, and that we're trying to conserve the wrong resource. Using fewer kilowatt hours of energy does not mean that you're using fewer resources. A kilowatt hour that's needed on demand in one place at one exact time is way more expensive than one that's available when all that energy is being produced. So a lot of what needs to happen on the grid is load shifting. Bitcoin mining is the biggest industrial scale use of that, but there's a number of other things that we can do in order to shift load to make our grid more robust and cheaper to run.
Well, I was going to get into what do these Bitcoin loads in Texas do to help advance the grid? You mind if I can go that
for
way?
it.
So Chad's project, I'm going to use it because he's already talked about it, but 700 megawatts into an area, and other sites we're working on. What happens whenever you actually do that? He mentioned an FEA, that's a facilities extension agreement, and with it becomes a security. He was saying everything's capital intensive. Well, he has to put up a lot of money for the utility to go upgrade their facilities. He either has to put it down on a deposit or a letter of credit. So articles are written saying, oh, it's threatening to raise mom and pop's power price. Well, the truth is Chad is securitizing that, and he's saying, I will put this load here, and if I don't, we'll true up at the end whatever you actually receive from me versus what I put down as security. So that function right there, a lot of people don't see that part of it. And the other thing that line upgrade does is it adds a lot more stability. Just think of it as I-35. What if it had another 4 lanes? A lot more cars, which would be electrons, would be able to get down into Austin where people are using the power. So he's taking lines, he's making them newer, he's making them bigger, and he's making them more robust because they're adding, some spots have single circuit, he's adding a second one. He's adding more lanes on these electric roads, and with that is coming a lot more stability for everyone, and it's coming the ability for those wind producers that have excess power, which just means that they have to either churn off or pay someone else in order to produce. Negative price power is a giant problem for those guys. So he's now making them more economic because their projects are, someone's actually buying the power. And then on top of it, they have more alternatives to get out there. And ultimately from the CREZ, not many people live out in West Texas. A lot live over here in Austin, Dallas-Fort Worth, San Antonio, Houston. So to get it from over there to over here, and if we want actually more renewable projects to be built out there, we need more transmission lines, and those don't happen unless we pay for them or projects come along that require upgrades. So Chad is advancing the grid far beyond what you see just right there at the Sandow plant. They're putting all sorts of redundancies upstream of him, and those redundancies benefit everyone, but he paid for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. If you look at costs on the grid, one of the biggest costs to running a grid is the fact that there's all this underutilized capacity that has to be paid for by the kilowatt hours, the megawatt hours that are consumed. But when those megawatt hours are all consumed at the same time by residential people, that pushes up the price of residential electricity. So for example, say we wanted to run our grid entirely on nuclear power. We currently run at less than a 50% load factor. So if we built out nuclear for the whole grid, it would cost more than twice as much to run the grid at the current load shape that we have versus a flat load curve. So the more that we can load shift, the better it is for prices for everybody in terms of lowering the price for average consumers, for industrials, for everybody, because we're making better utilization of the existing resources that we have, as well as getting economies of scale as we're expanding. This is another one of the big problems of a lot of grids that are trying to both conserve energy at the same time they're trying to innovate in the energy sector. It's very difficult to fund new projects when you have a decreasing demand in electricity. You need additional demand in electricity in order to spur investment and innovation, and eventually that takes over. This is what you saw, for example, in natural gas. Like natural gas, you had a grid that's increasing in load. Natural gas is a lot of energy, a lot of investment went into developing the technology, and eventually it got so much cheaper than coal that it just ate the entire coal market. But that wouldn't have happened if you didn't have that financial incentive to innovate. And I think that's one of the things that's really exciting about ERCOT right now is because you have this increasing market demand, increasing market size, it opens up a lot of opportunity for innovation.
Yeah, this is why, I mean, a lot of people like to commonly refer to as Bitcoin miners as buyers of last resort, but they certainly are that in certain cases. But in cases like this, they're buyers of first resort to incentivize the expansion of these projects. And so this takes us to not this particular point, but one thing I want to touch on is the narrative around this, right? So we're seeing in Kazakhstan right now, Bitcoin miners getting kicked off because they're taking too much electricity from the grid. We saw it in Quebec. We've seen it in Venezuela. How do we prevent that from happening in Texas? And I think what Chad is doing at Windstone, the presentation you just gave, like that, forming a narrative in that way is definitely beneficial. But there's a lot of friction when people see Bitcoin miners coming in, spinning up hundreds of megawatts and taking electricity. People don't understand the intricacies that we're getting into today. From a narrative perspective, how are we getting in front of this?
It's a very hard thing to do because at the end of the day, if someone doesn't understand the value of why you're using electricity, it doesn't matter. If you didn't believe that you should have an AC in your house, you'll never understand it. Like everyone's AC would be a waste. So a lot of people have that intrinsic problem, but I think in Texas we're in a much better spot. Governor Abbott has come out, multiple times and said, I want this to be the, Bitcoin mining mecca of the world. And that's because he understands. And he doesn't just understand the jobs. He understands what a flexible resource does and what different issues we have in the state. He wants the wind producers to make more money. He wants these solar producers to make money. He wants his natural gas guys to make money. And he wants those natural gas guys to stick around because we need that on-demand power. At the end of the day, for grid stability and everything else that's going on, we need on-demand power. If you look at California, they have a lot of issues because they drove out that on-demand power and said, oh, we'll build all this solar and wind. But at the end of the day, even if you overbuilt your grid 5 times on wind and solar, well, at night, if the wind stops blowing, what do we do? Because guess what? The wind does stop blowing in Texas. Not very often, which is good. Lots of wind power. But like August 2019, we went up to our market cap at $9,000 a megawatt hour, and that's because the wind died. So you can't overbuild your grid to that point. And our current administration and a lot of people within ERCOT understand the intricacies of this power. So the people that are actually making the policies versus writing the articles, they understand the benefits. So I think there's a doing versus writing about. I've talked to reporters that then you read the article, it's like, I know for a fact they know that's not exactly how it works, and this is a very slanted angle, and they added this word in there to protect themselves because they're not really saying it, but they're insinuating that we're adding to the price of mom and pops, but a flat load actually lowers cost for people. Natural gas guy wants to be able to predict his power output on the day, and he's competing against wind. Well, if there's more load and Bitcoin miners will shut off at a certain point, he can estimate that a lot better, and more load helps everybody.
Yeah, I think there's 2 important points to point out here. One is that Texas, from a cultural standpoint, is an energy state. Energy is the lifeblood of Texas. A lot of people in Texas have made their money either producing or consuming energy. So in general, this state is going to be a lot more accepting than other places of additional energy projects of any type. In addition to that, there's a lot of people, like the people in the grid in Texas that work in power, they all understand the value of this. This is massive differentiated value versus anything else that we've seen in a very long time in terms of the grid. And then it's accelerating, like it is It's stepping in where a lot of other technologies just have not been able to scale fast enough, and it's providing differentiated value to things like batteries or peaker plants, and it's opening up a lot of opportunity for the state. The other thing I would mention is that Bitcoin mining is not just consuming energy, it's paying for the energy. So it's funding additional energy development. Bitcoin is $100 billion funding mechanism for energy development. We would be stupid to not harness that. This is a massive prize for us to go out and get, and it's a subsidy for us to be able to build out our grid and make our grid more robust. The more Bitcoin mining in the state of Texas, the more that the Bitcoin network is paying for our state's grid. That is objectively a great thing for us.
Are you saying that Bitcoin mining incentivizes cheap, abundant energy?
and not only that, like, I think another thing that I think is just kind of fun to point out is, like, we're thinking about energy the wrong way. There is way more energy on the planet than we could ever harness. Even just in the state of Texas, so National Renewable Energy Laboratory did a study on this. They looked back in 2012. Using 2012 technology, we could produce more electricity from wind power than all electricity consumed in North America, and more electricity from solar than all electricity consumed in the world. So there's a ton of resource in the state of Texas. The key is, how do we take that intermittent resource that's produced, that's available in areas where people are not living, and actually make that useful? And Bitcoin is the first step to that. Bitcoin miners, we just need an internet connection. We can go wherever, right to the source. But that's just the start of the catalyst that is needed to spur the state of Texas to be able to use those energy resources for all types of other heavy industry. We need steel production, aluminum production, all sorts of heavy industry in Texas. I mean, just look at global supply chains today. If you look at what's going on with Russia being cut off from the rest of the world suddenly, it's causing massive problems to their supply chains. If China did the same thing to the US, we would be screwed. We need to have production in the US of those base metals, and you're not going to do that anywhere else in the US. You're not going to do that in the Rust Belt anymore. Like, we built coal power out in those other areas because coal was what was cheap. That is not what's cheap anymore. What's cheap is natural gas, wind, and solar, and Texas has the most of all three of those resources of any state in the country. And it's the only state where you have the convergence of all three in the same geographic area, and that puts Texas at, this is one of those things about, if we really want to say you want to decarbonize a specific industry, where are you going to do that in the US? The only place that has this complementary wind and solar profile is Texas. So Texas can use all of these narratives as a way to increase industry in the state. We can ride these waves, and it can be Texas can be the leader in a new generation of clean industry globally.
Again, this stuff is right in front of us, and for some reason or another, there is this movement out of DC, an environmentalist movement that is trying to prevent this from happening. I think what we need to do as an industry is just get out there and educate about these things. I think you guys are doing incredible work in that. We need Meredith Angwin's fatal trifecta to be understood by kids in high school. I mean, it is just like people don't understand money, and they question Bitcoin. They don't understand energy grids, how electricity gets delivered to them. So I think the Bitcoin mining industry and what Nick and Jesse are doing to expand the grid and educate people about what they're doing is very important work. So thank you, gentlemen. Are we done?
Appreciate it.